Howdy ho, friends and foes, and welcome to Dads on Life, your weekly episodic show about parenting from a male perspective. I'm your host, Jay Miles, and with me, as always, my co-host, asshole, Keith Bogan.
Numbnuts, you bastard. Good morning.
Chad Holloway.
Good morning.
And Dave Dusenberry.
What up?
Doug is on assignment. He's busy with it is Old Home Week in Bath, Pennsylvania, and Doug, being a council member, is running around probably like a chicken with his head cut off, doing God knows what this morning. They've had events all week at night, so he's probably prepping for what should be one of the last ones, and he should be back with us next week. As for today's topic, I'm going to actually turn it over to Dave, and he is going to introduce it.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about we're going to focus on one key word, and that's perspective, right? So my older boy, about a month and a half ago or so, mentioned something interesting to me. He had said that we were talking about just like, looking at life and looking at the world and things like that. He had told me that I was one of the few adults that he knew, on either my side or his mom's side or anybody, that actually took the time to see the world and to teach about the world from his perspective rather than my own, or rather than an adult's perspective, like somebody who grew up in the 80s and 90s. I was trying to actually actively see the world and kind of guide him through the reality that he lives in, not the one that I was raised in. And I thought that was really interesting. And I don't know if that's something that is more widespread. I know that we as adults, we tend to teach and we tend to raise and we tend to provide lessons based on how we were raised. I mean, makes sense. We utilize the stuff that we learned as we were growing up and that we embraced as we were coming of age, and we use that as our kind of basis for how we then teach our kids. But I thought it was interesting that my son said that it seems that, while that makes sense, that there's not a lot of adults that actually try to actively make an effort to see the world that he's living in as opposed to the one that we're living in. I mean, his world is completely different than mine. I mean, the amount of technology he has access to, the information he has access to, the issues of the world that he's dealing with, vastly different than what I was raised in or what I grew up in. And it was interesting that he had mentioned that there's not a lot of adults that take the time to really see the world from his perspective. So I wanted to throw that out to you guys. Is that something that has been brought to your attention? Is that what do you think about that?
Well, I would say from my perspective, I probably have not been good at looking at the world from Frankie's perspective. I kind of impose what I've got a lot of times, I think, on him and kind of what I have experienced. And but I think a lot of the things, the world is very different in certain respects. I'm kind of thinking out loud here. Sorry for my rambling, but the world is very different now. But like, for example, the one thing we do have in common is we've got sports in common. So I was always pretty straight up with sports, like, you can't do that. You gotta, when he was real young, he'd be like, Dad, I got hurt. I'd be like, well, you gotta man up. You gotta go out there and you gotta keep going. You gotta work through the pain and kind of all these things that I was taught, right? And that I had success with. I mean, I'm not giving him advice that I think is bad. I'm giving him advice that I think is good, but it is from my perspective. But the other day I saw a TikTok, and I think this kind of sums up what you're talking about. And it's something that I have done myself as well. It had two scenarios with the son. The son went up and he slammed his door. And then in the first case, the dad pulls the door off and he's walking out with the door under his arm, right? That's kind of the old world perspective. Mm-hmm. And I have done that with a stepdaughter before, right? Mm-hmm. And then the other one, the kind of second part of it is the kid slams his door and his dad goes to his room and he says, hey, what's up? What's going on? What you seem like you have an awful lot of anger for how big of an issue this really is. Let's talk about it. So I think that was a great example. I mean, it's I've got an 11-year-old now, girl that I can talk to who has I think a very different perspective. I probably won't be able to relate to too much, but I'm going to do my best. But asking them what's going on with them and how they feel about things, I think is very important. As opposed to just going the old direction and just yanking the door off the hinges. Oh, you don't deserve a door if you're going to slam it.
Yeah, no, that's true. And it's true. I guess because I love following and reading up on like psychology and human behavior and things like that, I tend to, when I talk to all of my kids, whether it's my daughter or my two sons, I try to actively talk to them. I want to find out what's going on in their head so that I can then, hopefully be able to guide them and give advice on where they're going. And sometimes I can. Sometimes I'm just like, we'll be talking about things. I'll be like, look, this is what I see. This is what I think is going on. If I'm wrong, correct me. And that based on that, I see these couple of choices that we can kind of go with, and kind of teach using that method rather than you will do what I say because I'm the one in charge. And I think that for me, that tends, and you know what, it's funny because that tends to work for me. So maybe even though I'm trying to do that, like, I'm trying to see things from his perspective, I'm really just like, that's just a method that works for me. Like, I like it when people are on the level with me and actively engage with me and get my opinion on things.
Mhm.
So that's what I'm trying to teach my kids to do. Like when you're talking to somebody, find out where they're coming from or find out what's going on. It's more than just what you see and feel. Look at the whole picture and like, let's look at different options and figure out which way you want to go. And it's just a different way of looking at things.
Well, there was a situation with what happened earlier this week, where novelist Salman Rushdie was brutally attacked.
Mhm.
He was stabbed several times, leading to a surgery. There's reports that he may lose an eye, has liver damage, was on a ventilator, couldn't talk. Well, obviously, we understand you can't talk when you're on a ventilator. But the ventilator was removed last night. We were talking about it, and my wife brought up something about an assassination attempt, and I said, "Well, it's not. Technically, it's not, because assassination attempts are on politicians, not celebrities. Salman Rushdie is nothing but a novelist. Just like John Lennon's was not an assassination, it was a murder. I mean, you can say it all you want. They're not assassinations.
Okay.
But Biggie and Tupac were not assassinated. They were murdered. Anyway, you take the perspective of a situation like that, where things and school shootings and things like that, these were rarities in our time growing up. So our reaction to them are going to be different because maybe we're a little bit more desensitized to things like that.
Mhm.
So, especially with Salman Rushdie, I remember I was 10 when Ayatollah Khomeini basically put a hit on him.
Yeah, the
For
fatwa.
all intent and purposes.
Yeah.
So something that really they're not going to hear of now is a civil leader of a leader of a country putting a hit on a man. You're not going to hear that in this day and age. Or it may happen, but you're not going to hear about it.
Mhm.
So yeah, you're going to take that into perspective. Our perspectives are built because of what we've been through and what we've seen in our lives, like 9/11, like things like that. So it's a different world they're being raised in, obviously. So our perspective is shaped. But yeah, so our reactions to something that happens now and trying to explain it in our perspective it's going to be a little skewed. So
Yeah, it's just, and it's wild because trying to find the line of teaching based on what we've been through versus teaching based on what our kids are going through
Mhm.
is a difficult one, because the stuff that they have going on in their world, we may look at it and obviously we frame it from what we've seen. All decisions are based on prior experience or knowledge that you have. I mean, that's how things are working. So naturally, each generation is going to make different decisions based on that information that they have. And what I found with my kids, and I think what they appreciate, is that I try to take the time to learn what that information is rather than make that decision strictly based on what I know. I want to ask the questions and find out where they're at, because that'll help me and help them figure out what direction they want to go. And I just found it very interesting that, at least according to my son, again, it's a sample size of 1, so it's not a very big sample size, but that's not a very common approach amongst his peers and the parents that they have.
Well, it's fascinating that you say that, because it's probably not very common, because most people don't care to attempt to look at the world through anyone else's eyes but their own, period, whether or not it's our generation or the kids, or just our generation and our generation. We suck in general about trying to see anything except through our own eyes. I am going to abuse Jason later because he has the wrong definition of the word assassinate. We'll get to that later.
Yes. I'm with you, Keith, on that, actually.
I have the legal definition sitting right here in front of me, so bite me, Jason. Anyway, with that said, interesting story that just happened in 36 hours. As you guys know, I've been on this voyage with my sons as one of them performs in a world-class drum corps. So we've been in a lot of different cities, and in order to corral 110 people who are roughly between the ages of 15 and 21, not to mention the slew of volunteers and staff members that go along with it, there's got to be some process. There's got to be some rules and procedures and such. But the 15 to 21-year-olds don't really care about all that stuff. They kind of do what you tell them to do most of the time. So here we are, was Friday night, and we were finishing up the performances and all the other activities that were happening at the venue. And the guideline was, guys, everybody, we call it butts in seats. Everybody has to have their butts in their seat on the bus, getting ready to come back to the hotel by, I think it was midnight. And 2 of the 21-year-olds, not minors, 2 of the 21-year-olds decided, screw it, we're going to go to a bar and hang out for a while. And they showed up 2 hours late. So meanwhile, all of the other people on the bus, on that particular bus, were just waiting. They were just stuck there because they obviously were not going to leave without any of the kids, even if they are of age, if you will. That set in motion a whole series of chain of events that in our world, we all know that drivers now have, bus drivers, truck drivers, all that, have all these stringent regulations about how long they can drive before they have to rest, and how long they have to rest before they can drive again, and all that stuff. Completely botched our Saturday schedule. We had to let the drivers sleep a lot later. We had to leave later, so we missed some. We didn't miss any of our own activity, but the kids missed a lot of opportunity throughout the course of Saturday to do things in Indianapolis that they could have done. That were key, that are good for people who are in drum corps. And then we had to wrap up much earlier. We had to wrap up 4 hours earlier Saturday night. So they missed all the big events at the end of the evening as well. And I said, well, did those 2 kids, those 2 21-year-olds, have any idea what the consequences were? And I had several volunteers, one in particular, just jump ugly on me. Of course they would understand that would affect the drivers, and that they would have to, change the schedules and all that. And I'm like, I'm sorry, even at 21, how many of them actually know anything about bus transportation laws and NTSB stuff and all that, and well, how truck drivers and bus drivers have to, what their rules and regulations are for when they can drive. They just assume it. I'll bet they, in fact, the 21-year-old said, something, the bus knows we're 21. They'll just go back to the hotel and we'll get an Uber. And they just blew it off because they don't think about anything else. But the other volunteers, particularly this one guy who I will not mention, just got really angry. He wouldn't even talk to me about it. That's ridiculous. Of course they understand the bus regulations. Talk about not being able to look at things through the eyes of someone else, let alone someone who's much younger. With all that said, my kids think that I'm the get off the lawn guy. I'm the old man who can't see anything but my own perspective and all that. And here I am, I'm the only rational one in the room who says kids are looking at things differently. There's no reason to think that they would actually look at it the way we're looking at it. But Justin and Jeremy are like, yeah, Dad, you're a moron. You never look at it anyway, but through the eyes of an old man.
Mm-hmm.
So even when you do the right thing, I think there's a number of us who do try to look at things and try to learn about how young people look at things. Maybe we're good at it, maybe we're not, but we try. I'm not sure the younger generation gives us a whole lot of credit for it, because some of the time we're going to be wrong. Some of the time we're going to be overwhelmed with our own perspectives and our own way we were raised, teachings. So we're not going to get it very quickly. And that's the impression my sons have, is like, Dad, you're just a moron. But there are plenty of times when I get it faster than they do, and I totally understand the perspective, but they're not going to give me any credit for that. So,
and it's interesting too when we talk about like understanding the perspective of 21-year-olds who you don't know versus our own kids. I think there's a big difference between those two, and I know I'm certainly going to be more in tune with Frankie as opposed to a group event. If there's a group event, I'm like, hey, the rules are the rules. Let's get going. They may have their reasons. There may be problems, and I would try to help, but still, So I'm probably a little bit on the other side of you, Keith, but not to the point where I'm going, those assholes or whatever. But it's like, hey, we're a group. To maintain our schedule, we have to be where we have to be at times. But and the other thing is, what I was thinking about is, we all grew up in a different time than our kids, and we understand kind of our lives and have made sense of it, right? And I think they're trying to understand their lives at this point and make sense of it. But one of the things from my perspective is, I think, and I trust, a lot of times I'll go to an adult or an adult friend for advice more than I would, I think, to someone like our kids, like our children, because we have more data points as well. So there's something that goes along with that. And certainly it might be different historical milieu, different time period, different set of events that happen, but at the same time, we have many more experiences to know different things, like to know that, I don't know, an example would probably be like first love, when they break up with that first boyfriend or girlfriend, how we went through it, how they're taking it. And It's a big deal. It is a big deal. Having your heart broken is a big deal, right?
Sure.
But being able to explain that without saying, "Oh, there's other fish in the
Plenty of fish in the sea, and
you can't
we've heard
minimize
all-
their feelings, right?
Yeah.
So, but luckily we have some resources, I think, that we can bring to the table, and some experiences to be able to say, hey, have you thought about this, and help them to understand it. So
I think what you just said, I think that was a key thing. And I think talking about minimizing feelings like that, that tripped something in my head, because I think when parents just speak, or they just issue commands or verbiage or whatnot without actually asking the questions of their children about where they're at, how they're feeling, what they got going on inside. If you're just talking to them, there tends to, I know for me, like, I feel like somebody was dictating to me and not taking into account anything of what I have going on in my head. I understand you got lots more experience on this. I get that. That's fine. That's cool. That's in your head. That's not what's in my head. It may be similar, but it's not the same. I want, I would feel like somebody was trying to minimize how I was feeling, regardless of their intention at the time. So I think that's a very, very key part of what you just said. I think taking the time to understand and not minimize what, in what we're talking about, our kids, like what they're thinking and feeling, and using and taking that time, even if the advice is the same, taking a moment to understand where they're coming from first before moving on, I think is very important.
When you minimize or trivialize someone's opinions, in my case, it becomes almost like the Charlie Brown teacher.
Yeah.
To me, what you're saying will kind of, I'm going to tune you out if you're going to minimize and trivialize what I'm saying. So, yeah, I understand that. And one thing about this is, a lot of people, I'm not going to say a lot of people, sorry, I shouldn't generalize, but there are people that aren't very fluid. They're very rigid. They're very set in what they do.
Mhm.
So they some people don't have the ability to even hear and take into account what our kids are saying and what they're going through.
Yeah.
In this kind of perspective, they don't have it. They don't have the ability to use it.
If I may, Jason, is it ability or is it desire?
Both.
I think it's both, because honestly, I believe this. I don't, and this goes back to what you initially opened with, Keith, about how we all tend to be very self-focused on our own lives. I think it's a learned skill. I think it's a learned skill. I think it's something that needs to be practiced. And I think it's something that needs to be worked on actively, because it's not something that just comes naturally, because naturally we all just want to look at the world through our own eyes, and that's how we process everything.
Right.
But actually working on taking the time to open our perspective to see how other people look at things, which is different than us, I think that's something that has to be practiced. I don't think it's something that comes innately.
No, and it's something that going through what I've gone through with AA, and that that's a big key in your own success. If you even, I mean, I'm sure you've all seen them, at least in passing, the 12 steps, or something similar to it. The biggest thing about it, the first thing that I noticed as soon as I walked in and actually read them, I went, oh yeah, there's no I.
Yeah.
Nothing is I. There's no mention of I in it at all. Everything's we.
Yep.
And and the other thing is people think it's a program of religion. God's mentioned in the first 3 steps. That's it. That's the only mention of God really at all in the steps. It's God as you see him. So it's not a religious-based program. But the biggest thing is, like I said, to do what we did last week with the barbecue and pulling that off. I hit 2 years ago, it would have been extremely difficult to do what I had done, because I just wouldn't have wanted to listen to anybody's opinion or anything like that. But as I've gotten sober, it kind of was like, and like somebody would say something, and I kind of got used to a quick of, maybe I should listen, because it's somebody with 30 years who has probably done this before, even though we've only done one barbecue before this, of, yeah, their ideas are probably right. They're probably onto something. Maybe I should listen. And it comes with striving for progress.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that I'm going to say there's a lot of people that in life in general have stopped striving for progress.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if we see the polarization that has gone on in the last 4 or 5 years in this country, there's a lot of people that have lost sight of progress.
I think you brought up a good point, Jason, because again, I don't have firsthand experience of the program, but my brother
Right.
has been in recovery for 32 years at this point.
I think that's what you
42,
said.
32 years at this point. He went in 1990. So I'm familiar with the 12 steps. And one of the things that I saw in his life, and I think it actually kind of ties into what we're talking about today, is we mentioned that some parents are just rigid, that they can't see the world through somebody else's perspective, that they don't want to take the time to do that. They only want to teach you thing. And really, it's summed up in one word: control, right? So we want to control the narrative. We want to control what's going on. We want to control our own inner reality as well as everything outside. It's all about control, and lack of control by nature is very, very uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah.
So when we parent, parenting's uncomfortable just on its face. So we naturally want to go towards things that will help us feel in control. And I think sometimes going that route can lead to a sense of rigidity, because if you're asking for somebody else's perspective on things, that's not your own. So that's outside of your control. That's hard. That's really, really interesting point.
It goes back to the Serenity Prayer.
Yeah,
If
it
you
does.
really think
It
about
really
whether
does.
you're religious or not. Everything goes back to the Serenity
does.
Prayer.
It does. That's why I'm a big do what you can with what you have where you're at kind of guy. Like, because that's all you can do. You have to understand where your limits are, and you can't control everything. And the addict's perspective, and a lot of, even folks that I know that are of a more conservative bent, control factors heavily into that, because they don't want the world to be outside of what they're comfortable with.
Doug will be smiling when he hears me talk about the Serenity Prayer, because this is the first time I think I mentioned religion in the entire 2.5 years we've been doing this.
Jeremy, Jesus Christ, Jason, you touched on something that is very obvious. This conversation about perspectives between how our kids look at things and how we look at things, and the rigidity that most adults have that prevents them, or they choose not to want to look at it through their kids' eyes. We could easily take this conversation to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, easily.
Oh, absolutely.
And by the way, it isn't 4 or 5 years; it's about 20 years now. In my opinion, it precedes the Obama presidency that there's people
Sure. You can.
throat. Sure, I want to blame somebody 4 or 5 years ago, but it's not. That didn't start then. That's for sure.
I would go.
You can take it back to September 11th if you really want to.
I would go back to 1994, 1995, the start of the moral majority with Newt Gingrich coming on as House Speaker. But
yes,
a student of history. That's where I would go.
Time frame. That's exactly the time frame I think it was. But anyway, with that said, I think that it's people actively choose not to listen to each other's perspectives in Washington. That's for sure.
Yes.
Mhm.
They even know each other's perspectives, and they're like, "F you, I don't care." Most people think they're trying to understand their kids' perspective, but they just do a very poor job of it.
Yep.
I mean, it's really hard. The world that my sons are growing up in, and the expected behaviors and the access to information, like you talked about, Dave, it's just so radically different. It feels like they're so radically different than what we grew up in the 70s and 80s and such, that no matter how hard we try, it's almost impossible. We certainly can't put ourselves in their shoes. We can only grasp certain concepts and try to listen as much as we can. But like Washington, most people are just terrible at listening. And that's why I go back to my whole concept of, is it the ability to listen, or is it the desire to listen? And I would postulate that it's the desire.
Yeah. I think
it's a combination, but it's mostly, I think, people just don't even try.
I think every generation, I mean, I know my parents, my generation, my kids, I think every generation has a certain level of informational and societal ignorance that comes with it. We have our bubbles that we grew up in, our environments that we grew up in, what was the norm at the time, and honestly, what my kids have right now, they have by leagues, a lower level of just general ignorance because of the tools that they have at hand. My son's best friend is trans. And it's funny. I started using the they pronoun and be more comfortable with it before he did. Like, because I was like, okay, if that's the situation, then that's what I will use. I'm totally cool with that. It doesn't matter to me. I don't care. If it makes somebody else more comfortable, then that's just a little bit of effort on my part. But it's funny, doing that little thing, my son recognized that and appreciated that. It's like, because for his world, that's normal. That's normal, accepted, totally cool. For a lot of folks in our generation, as we all know and as we have all seen, people are all up in arms. Whoa, what is this? And I'm like, and that's just the difference between the world that he's growing up in and the world that I grew up in. And just taking that one little step of using one single word can make all the difference in the world. That's seeing the world from his perspective and not my own.
Although we're doing a really good job of talking about the battle we engage in every day to try to look at it through their perspectives.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the other way around. So one of the things that irritates me at times is that my kids, and kids in general, I guess, but my kids, I'm only going to talk about them, seem to be incapable of understanding that I grew up in a world where the first Black student that went to my school was in high school. And there was only one. I went to a lily white school for sure, for a school system for sure.
Yep.
The first time I encountered anything that resembled diversity was when I went to college at Rutgers. Not even Brookdale Community College my first year, because that was lily white too. So I'm not expecting them to do this, but they don't stop and think, Dad grew up in a world where it wasn't even uncommon to throw the N-word around and not even realize what it meant. Just it got used. Or throw the F word around. I didn't know what it meant to be gay until I went to college. Because I didn't know, it wasn't around me. I didn't have any concept of it. So like most people who grew up in the 60s and 70s, if somebody was acting in a way where they were too shy to engage in whatever was going on, the F word flew. Don't be and we didn't mean it in the gay sense. We didn't mean it in the homosexual, heterosexual sense. My kids, if they knew how often that word was used in conversations when I was younger, would probably never speak to me.
Yeah.
Because
The R word, same way.
That was our environment.
And that's the societal ignorance that we grew up in. Like, that's just because that's how our world was framed. To us, it was acceptable. Not for nothing. My mom talks about this. My mom, who was born in 47 and grew up in the 50s and the 60s, a much different world. The terms that were thrown around that were considered acceptable in popular culture in her time. I mean, by the time my generation got to the point, there was a lot of stuff that went on back then that became frowned upon as I was growing up, and now it's gotten a lot more. And I think to your point, Keith, I think when it comes to our kids about how it seems that they have a difficult time accepting what our bounds were. So there's a difference between understanding and acceptance. I don't think it's a big lift to have them to try to understand it. I don't expect them to accept it because they don't need to. Their world is different. What's acceptable to them is different than what was acceptable to us in our general time of societal ignorance that we grew up in.
Right. And I totally understand that. But what frustrates me is that we can now, the four of us and our generation, can sit back and say it was wrong to use the F word. It was wrong to use the N word. It was wrong to do this and this and this. We get it now and we want a different way. But they don't seem to want to forgive us for what we did 30 years ago. They still think we should have known better. We should have never been there in the first place.
Yep.
And that's where I have some frustration, because everything is learned.
Yeah.
You know, if you grow up in a world where those words are flying around, you just assume they're appropriate until you learn.
Yep.
Right.
And I guarantee you, there are words that they're throwing around now that their kids are going to be really angry with them for having ever used.
Happens every generation. Go ahead, Chad.
The other thing is that the meaning of these words, the meaning attributed to these words has changed.
Yes.
You use the F word, you didn't, that wasn't a derogatory, that you were talking to one of your friends, right? Probably, you know, it was more of a term like between you and that person.
Yeah.
It was a term of endearment.
Yeah.
Now, if a third party heard it, they might be offended by it.
Yeah.
And in today's world, they would be offended by it because the meanings of words change over time. That's one of the things. So there's, from my perspective, there'd be nothing to be sorry for. I mean, if you said that today, that's a whole different deal. But back then, hey, that's how things were. But I think the other piece, Keith, that you're talking about is as they age, like I alluded to it earlier, we have a lot more data points, right?
Mhm.
So we're twice their age, at least. And we have learned how things operate in the world. They're still learning that. So from their perspective, oh my gosh, that's a static concept. Why did you use those words back then? But for us, we go, the meaning of those words changed, the thought processes in the world changed, the way people look at things changed, we're moving forward, and they don't see that yet, I don't think.
You know, one thing. Oh, go ahead.
Hold on. I don't know. Let's hold it with the moving forward part right now.
Okay.
All right. I don't know if we're really moving forward. Let's be honest.
We're
But
not.
there
Our
were
generation isn't, but the next generation is.
there were it was the same thing with the R word, if you remember.
Yeah. Yep.
And now it's something with the word spaz.
Yeah.
I mean, I've still heard it thrown around until recently, and when everybody kind of realized the origins of it. So
what was the word?
like
I'm sorry.
spaz.
Spaz?
Yeah.
Yeah,
S-P-A-Z.
it's a
Yep.
condition.
Okay.
Right, they had
Yeah,
two.
it's a condition.
Wasn't it
It's a
Beyonce
condition.
who had to take it out of one of her lyrics of one of her recent
Yeah.
songs?
So yeah, it's a type of palsy.
Yeah.
That's a spastic condition.
It's a condition. Yeah. The other thing is harkening back to, let's just go back to something of the lyrics of My Hometown from Bruce Springsteen.
Yep.
Anybody remember the one verse in there about a shotgun blast? He's talking about black and white, and there was a shooting in a light when he was younger. When he was in high school, there was a shooting.
Yeah.
So I mean, I get where you're coming from, Keith, with the first African American being in your class not until high school. So yeah, that perspective is definitely there and shown. Now it's like, when I started growing up, when I grew up, thinking, geez, it was probably, third or fourth grade that I think maybe second, now that I think about it, that we had the first African American that I remember in our school. So it wasn't, and Old Bridge is pretty diverse, but it just, maybe I don't have the memory of it. It just, yeah.
And you guys grew up in Jersey at that time, right?
Yeah.
Oh wow, I'm totally shocked that you guys didn't have much more mixed schools.
It's funny because Keith was talking about his time in school, and it greatly mirrors mine. I was a short kid. I grew up, Ocean County, and I grew up, down in the outskirts of the Pine Barrens in South Jersey, and it was not ethno-diverse at all. And I just as Keith shared his experience, my first real taste with people of different walks of life was after I graduated high school. Honestly, when I started coming up to like the Bound Brook area in Central Jersey and started doing Rocky Horror on a regular basis on the weekends, I met some of the coolest, most diverse, messed up, just all over the place people. And that experience helped frame a lot of what I've seen since. And there are a lot of folks that just never escape their hometown, so they never get that.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought of that you mentioned, Keith, I think this is important, is that, the terms that we used amongst our peers when we were growing up in conversation, obviously that's changed. And I think a big reason for that is the way that we communicated. So when we talked with our friends, when we were growing up, we got together, we were on our bikes, we were just hanging out in the neighborhood, at the arcade or doing whatnot, but it was all in person. These days, when kids hang out and they're talking with their friends, it's all online.
And a record of it exists.
And when it's online, not only is there a record of it, it is available and viewable to a much wider spread of people than just just your immediate friends. It's all on chat lines. So because of that, it has a lot, the conversation that we would have intimately between two people now has a potential worldwide exposure. So like you were saying, if somebody overheard you saying those terms amongst your friends, they'd be offended. That's exactly what's going on, because the way communication is done now is not just one-on-one. It's all done with honestly a global impact potentially because of online communication. I think that matters, and I think that is helping frame the change in language that we are seeing a lot more these days.
The spread out here in Old Bridge, it came, the big spread out really was the beginning of the 80s here. You had the spread outs because people in communities like the communities New York, Newark, all the northern communities, Newark, Jersey City, Essex County, Union County, Bergen County, and New York. That was where the spread out came from. And it happened in the early 80s. Like you had that, but strangely in our area, the spread out was slower of African American. There was more Indians that were spread out into Old Bridge. We were a huge target point, which wisely worked out pretty well for a lot of people. And it changed the diversities in the community pretty rapidly. And people, you had the influx out of New York, but there was a white influx out of those areas as well. So it was these were communities that all kind of knew each other, and all of a sudden they kind of all ended up here. So, and those of us that were, but my origins my family is also from East Rutherford and Kearney. So it was a lot of the same area, just kind of coming together and migrating into the same place. So that's why it kind of was like, maybe I don't remember it because it was here. I mean, we had African Americans here, but yeah, probably. But I would say Old Bridge, I would say there was more as I got into middle school. When the schools started coming together, the elementary schools, then it started to, the diversity grew in this town. And by high school, now the interesting thing with high school, when we got to high school, is we were two high schools. And we were the second graduating class of the merged high schools, of the two high schools coming together in Old Bridge. And that was a much bigger problem than any kind of ethnic diversity fluctuating into the area. So we, there were a lot of fights in the first couple of months, first year, I would say, of Old Bridge. And I'm glad now that, our kids are coming up in a time of not knowing two different high schools and not knowing, the kind of the haves and have-nots idea in this town.
So it's more of an economic issue.
Yeah.
Than ethnic.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's other issues rising in this town.
Yeah, this whole conversation is reached deep into my memory banks for something that happened when I was 4 or 5 years old. So I'm the old man in this group. So 4 or 5 years old was the mid 60s for me.
Yep.
And I had this, I can sort of picture it. One of the first non-cartoon shows that I watched when I was that age was Hogan's Heroes.
Yep.
Went along with Lost in Space and but I'm thinking, not the cartoons that a 4 or 5 year old will watch, but and Hogan's Heroes was always created as it was just a funny show. And even though you tell there were people who were doing wrong things and people who were trying to do right things in that show, everything was just funny. Everything was humor. So I remember I would hear this expression and then I would walk around the house and I would say it. And the expression was, Jawohl, Herr Commandant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Doug, you may not know this, but I'm Jewish. And in my father's side of the family, both sides are Jewish, but in my father's side, Dad got out of Nazi Germany in 1931, 2, somewhere in there. He escaped with his brother, his father, his mother, and one cousin. And everyone else died in the concentration camps. Everyone. The entire bloodline was extinguished except those 5 people. At the age of 4 or 5, my parents had protected me from it. They hadn't started to teach me about that stuff yet. So I didn't know any better. And I thought it was just a funny line, but I said it in front of my grandparents.
Oh.
And I have a vague memory of how hurt they were and how upset they were. But my parents stepped in and realized that I had a different perspective and no teaching at all. So they were able to fix it fairly quickly. And I learned very quickly. And they didn't teach me all the atrocities at the age of 4 or 5, but I learned really fast not to say that stuff.
Yeah.
It's sort of a perfect example of the different perspectives that age will provide for you. When I was in 3rd and 4th grade, I remember there was some other references to Hitler that made me imitate that particular evil character from history, because my best friend at the time was doing that. I still didn't really know much about Nazi Germany. I didn't know the story of our family history at all. In fact, my father had this deep German accent. I had no idea he did, because that's just my father. It's the way he spoke. I had no idea it was an accent. It turned out that my friend was rapidly becoming a Nazi. I mean, he literally went down that path. And after 5th grade, I never talked to him again, because then I really started to understand what the hell was going on. And he was a total scumbag and needed to be, like, he should have been put in fucking gas chambers. He just literally started worshiping all that stuff.
Yep.
But I didn't know any better, early on in that stuff. It's all about what you learn and when you're given the lessons. So, I mean, I know that from my childhood, I look back now and say, if I had known what things were, if I'd known the history pieces, if I had known the bad things that were associated with a lot of stuff that came out of my mouth when I was 4, 5, 7, 8 years old, that would never have happened. But until you learn a lesson, you're just imitating what's around you.
Yeah, well, and I think Hogan's Heroes was it was funny because it was making the bad guys look like nincompoops. I mean, the Allies were always getting over on him. Sergeant Schultz was an idiot. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the joke. That's the reason that show was funny, because it's making these horrible, evil people look like idiots, and they are, right?
They weren't made to look evil. They were made to look stupid.
They're made to look stupid, not bad. Yep.
Then it moved forward from there with Mel Brooks doing his first the producer.
Yeah.
Was the first one.
Yep. Yep.
And then there was another movie along the way that he kind of did something similar. Then it was again, it goes again with the remake of The Producers. And now into this day and time, with Jojo Rabbit, it's there's a very comical interpretation of Hitler in that movie, played by the director. So yeah, but Keith, I want to say one thing though. You're talking to Dave, not Doug.
Whatever.
Oh, fuck.
You know what? Not for nothing.
He's-
We might as well be twins. I mean,
Keith hasn't slept in how many hours?
That-
Lots.
that you can tell how delirious I am from the lack of sleep that I've had over the last couple of weeks. Yeah, that did.
When you were sitting back a minute ago, I almost said, "Hey, wake up, buddy."
Whatever the fuck your name is, you know.
But,
Yeah.
but you know, I think too, Keith, your story does a great job of exemplifying what you talked about earlier. Like,
Yeah.
on the one hand, as parents understanding the children, and the children understanding the parents.
Yeah.
And you know, for whatever reason there is, and I think I think Frank would probably tell you the same thing. He probably didn't understand where I come from because, you know, face it, as we age, you know, as a 25-year-old father with a 5-year-old or whatever it is, we're much more complicated. We're too complicated for a 5-year-old to understand.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, at a high level, they understand kind of who we are, but that's something they understand later on in life, kind of who we are. I mean, I think you understand your parents now pretty well from listening to you talk about different things, but we're in that situation now with our kids who are, you know, you and I have the kids in their 20s, and they're kind of learning on their own who they are, but they'll eventually learn who we are. And I think, you know, I expect Frankie to have a similar experience. Maybe I'm wrong, but I expect Frankie to have a similar experience as I did with my parents, because I was rebelling against my parents. But at a certain point I said, hey, you know what? They were right about a lot of things they said. And whether I agreed with them at the time or not, you know, it's right. It's right for their time. I remember the advice they gave me about working was get a good corporate job and stay with them forever. That's not where that's not the world we're living in now.
Nope, it's not, you know. And I agree, you know, when I talk to my kids, you know, we talk about mutual understanding, you know, parents understanding the kids' reality and the kids understanding the parents' reality. Mutual understanding only comes through the ability to actually ask and answer questions. So, you know, and to try to do it in a way that's not like emotionally lashing out, because you want to be able to keep the ability to both ask and answer those questions open as much as possible. And when we touch on touchy subjects, Keith, to your example about what's that going, that's a subject that's got a lot of emotion to it, and justifiably so. That is a conversation that, especially if you're 4 or 5-year-old and you're raising that can go really, really badly. Really badly. So it's awesome that it was conducted and done in a way that it didn't go really badly, because that can lead to a door closing. And as soon as that door is closed, it's really hard to open it again to be able to ask questions on that or a similar subject, you know? So like talking to my kids, that's why I try to take the time and ask a lot of questions, you know? And I always give them the look, if I'm asking too much, tell me, you know, tell me what you feel comfortable with, and I'm okay with that. And then we can always broach the subject later if you feel more comfortable, you know? But getting that back and forth. And I think this is a reason why, you know, when I talk about raising my kids, I really enjoy as they get older. I like it. Like, I know a lot of parents that are like, why can't my kids stay like 5 forever? And I'm like, no. I mean, look, they were cute and all, but I love the exchange as they get older and their brains start to develop more, and they're able to give me more of where they're at, what they got going on. Like, I love as they get older and I can start talking to them more and more. Like, I think it's awesome. You know, so, and one other thing too, just kind of going on a couple of parts back about the world that we live in. You know, the US was kind of formed on the basis of, you know, it's always described, like we're described as a melting pot, right? Everybody from every walk of life can come here and you know, make a better world. It's not, to use an old term, it's not segregated. At least it wasn't designed to be segregated, even though in practice it was.
Mhm.
The one thing I think we've seen is, while a lot of different cultures and a lot of different people came over here, they all were silent. Everybody was silent. I was silent in a white neighborhood. Some of us else were silent in a white neighborhood, conservative neighborhood. Everybody was silent in these different things. The internet has broken a lot of those silos. And I think breaking those silos has made a lot of people uncomfortable. The kids, they're used to it. they're like, yeah, the silos are broken. This is the way it's always been for us. That's why I think they're a lot more comfortable with some of the stuff than we are. Because for them, everything's always been kind of mixed up. And it actually is a melting pot in terms of culture, because that's what they experience every day in their interactions.
Yep. I remember a teacher, I think it was in high school, maybe early college, was talking about the melting pot. And she was like, well, it's less of a melting pot and more of a mulligan stew. Like you have your big clumps, so you have a big potato here, you got a big piece of
Yeah.
meat here. So we're less of a melting pot, more of a mulligan stew. I'm like, that's true.
Yeah. Yeah. But now those ingredients are really starting to kind of amalgamate together, you know? And it's based on the fact that their relationships, the people and places and things that they interact with, are not just within their immediate vicinity. They're interacting with folks like here in Jersey. You know, they can hop online and be talking in a game or be talking in a chat forum, you know, talking musical stuff with people in California, people in Idaho, people in
Yeah.
Czech Republic, you know, people in, you know, Spain, like worldwide. And
Mhm.
so when people interact with that kind of an audience, you get an exposure to other cultures and perspectives a lot faster than we did.
Yep.
Mhm.
I agree. And I think the ease of traveling too. I know for me, like I've traveled to a lot of countries. So
Yeah.
for example, going to Saudi Arabia was an eye opener for me. Just whole different world. And, I was definitely out of my comfort zone there, but I embrace other cultures and things like that. So, I've traveled to Asia and to Latin America, but that was a different one for me. I would say it was a good experience. But it was still very different. And to your point, our kids now have access to those things,
They do.
conversations online anyway, with other cultures immediately.
Yeah. And I think, to kind of break it down, like the key skill I think that I try to teach the kids is to not be afraid to ask questions and not be afraid to get answers that you may not agree with.
Yep, absolutely.
To take the time, if you get an answer that you don't agree with, that's fine. Do some follow-ups, and that's when you try to build that, see things from somebody else's world, because their world is different than yours.
Yep.
And my hope is by teaching that skill that my kids can kind of take that and use it moving forward on both maybe the people that they work with, the friends that they have, if and when the time comes they have families. Because think about it, if our kids are exposed to the kind of information availability that they have now, I mean, compared to where we were when we were kids, it's going to be that much more when they have kids. It's going to be that much more open. So, that's a lot of information to process, and being able to do it in a way that you're not trying to do it all yourself. You give up some of that control and you develop the skill of being able to ask questions and listen to answers and process information. That all builds perspective, empathy, and it's a way for us to kind of get on the same page with each other.
Yep, absolutely. And that is one thing that I've said. Again, I've been in lots of cultures, but the commonalities I see are people want to live happy. They want to be happy. Yeah. They want to raise their kids. They want to have a decent life. I mean, it doesn't matter where somebody's from. That's the commonality that I've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's up to us as parents, and certainly us as dads, to give our kids the building blocks to be able to do that.
Yep, Absolutely, I agree.
Well, I think the way that we do that is to not do a lot of things, to let them experience rather than this is how you should view things. This is how you should look at the guy who got really upset with me Friday night because, well, of course they should absolutely understand how drivers' rules are. They should, I happen to think that he has some very rigid viewpoints. We're also very difficult in the political divide. We've managed to forge a friendship because we're both there volunteering at the drum corps. So we, at the basic root of everything is we're there for the kids.
Yeah.
we have very different ways of looking at life in general. He comes from a whole different perspective on a lot of things. But we put it all aside when we're together for that.
Yep.
I was actually surprised to see him flare up the way he did, but at that point we were really tired. It was early the next morning, and we'd all gone to sleep at like 2:30 in the morning, and yeah, so whatever. But I think in that household, here's the law, here's the rule, here's how I look at things, and here's so you should do the same thing. In my household, it's much more. Tell me what your experiences are, and we'll talk about it. They rarely appreciate my perspective because it's old man, get off your lawn perspective, but I'll share it with them when they ask for it.
Yeah.
Right. Anybody else have anything they want to add before we start to wrap this up?
No, I think that's a good place to stop. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to give answers. Don't be afraid to do follow-ups, work to understand the world of the people that you're talking to. And for us parents, I think that especially includes their kids. You may be surprised at what they say.
Actually, I'm frequently afraid of what the answers are going to be, but I still ask the questions.
You have to. Yeah, I am too. I mean, my kids, some of the stuff that they deal with, I'm just like, I couldn't even imagine dealing with some of the stuff that they deal with. And especially when you have us jackass adults trying to preach to them, no, you shouldn't be doing that, when they're like, why not? It's perfectly fine for us. And we're trying to skew the results. It's like, we don't make the case any better for them, and I think we do our kids a disservice when we do that, so yeah, take the time.
Good discussion, guys.
Yeah.
I think that's like Dave said, I think this is a really good place to leave us. We have some other discussions we need to have over the next few weeks with some rising issues in schools in the US. So we gotta, we're cracking on that over the next few weeks. But as it is, from all of us here at Dad's on Life, take care, everybody. And of course, Keith, eat my shirts.
Bite me, you weasel. Have a wonderful week, everybody.
Have a good one, guys.
Take care, guys.